Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements. And we continue with Alex Hochuli's Omelets with Eggshells and the Failure of the Millennial Left, a review of If We Burn by Vincent Bevins, The Populist Moment by Yeager and Borriello, and The Death of the Millennial Left by Chris Catrone. This is the third part of the series, and I've been interacting with this series because I've also been talking about these things in real time for most of the time covered in this time period, which is if we start with Chris Catrone in 2006 at the kind of nadir of the anti-war movement against Bush, I've been slowly moving towards the left most of that time and commenting on it since 2010, 2011. Now, I note that I actually disagree with a lot of what Vincent Bevins says, although I agree why he says it, having read more of his book and gone into several interviews where he talks about the limitations of the way the media presented these movements to the world, the way that created a feedback loop amongst activists in these areas, particularly in Brazil. He does not seem to take the role of the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist movements, which are not horizontalist in the way that he's pretending, in the Arab Spring seriously enough. That's a problem. And a lot of the left was liquidated in these movements, both, as an ideological category. Sometimes, people were killed. Even within fights, within the opposition to Mubarak or to Yanukovych, etc. The idea that all these movements were primarily defined by, alter globalization anarchist, I can kind of believe in Brazil, and I can definitely believe in Europe. I don't believe it for a moment in the Middle East. And this is something we're going to have to get into, because Bevins critiques the over-reliance on English-speaking sources in his book, but his interviews indicate that he's kind of seemingly playing off of English-speaking sources himself, which limits your class access to people in that culture. As a person who lived in Egypt during the counter-revolution, I wasn't there, during the rule of Brotherhood or during the Tahrir Square days, but I was definitely there when Al-Sisi consolidated all of his power base. It wasn't just a failure of anarchist verticalism, it was also a failure of Islamist communitarian Bonapartism. They tried to make Morsi a Bonaparte, and they tried to override the Constitution, and the internal contradictions of that collapsed the government. Also, they had to rely on the same military that had put Mubarak in power in the first place. Anyway, that's the caveat to my disagreement with Bevins. We'll get into this more. The problem of organization. Catrone notes that the protests of the 2010s, like the 90s era left, understood themselves as doing resistance. Yes, I'm going to second this. The focus on resistance was huge. That was huge. It even became a thing in the popular front period of populism in America during the Trump administration, like the resistance. But the left started mocking at that time. But it was the standard left position during the anti-war period and during the altered globalization period. I always wondered about the framing, because resistance is like conservatism, like Demestre says about conservatism. It's already putting yourself in the defensive position. It means that you have more to lose, rather than trying to get reforms passed, let alone make revolution. The defensive stance in part explains the organizational form that the protest wave took: horizontal, leaderless, pluralist, spontaneous, and organized via social media. Asterisk. Well, the defensive stance came from somewhere. like the unions prior to the aught tens seemed like they were just milking grounds for Democratic Party funds. Like whatever didn't go into union operations and buildings went into Democratic lobby campaigns, and they got nothing back for it in 2008. Like, so a lot of people were fed up with that. They were fed up with trying to run third parties. They had tried. I mean, we have to remember that, like, the third party movement and the Nader Greens and all that were a real left formation in the 90s and aughts, with a pedigree through people like Nader to Peter Camejo that went back to the old new left. In some ways, Bernie came out of that, but was more willing to work with the Democrats and effectively caucus with them. So the defensive stance came because people thought at the time that, and the older people thought at the time, that a lot of the formations had been so thoroughly ensconced into New Deal Democratic, not New Deal, new Democratic leadership formations that it really wasn't reliable forms of protest. So anarchism became the way to mark yourself away from that. And we also have to remind ourselves that the Soviet Union fell in 1992 and that China economically liberalized in such an extent that it looked like communism was only going to be in a few rump states like the DPRK and Cuba. You cannot remove why people went into resistance mode from that material history. The ideas didn't come from nothing. So this was so irrespective of internal tensions that Bevins discovers in participant interviews. Anarchists saw their occupation of the streets and squares as creating prefigurative, spacious, and self-governing communities. Asterisk, yeah, they did. See Olive Graber's work before 2016, really, when Graeber starts really sounding like an MMT liberal, even though he claimed to still be an anarchist. One in which ultimately only students or the unemployed could participate in long term. Yes, that was always a problem. That was a problem with the occupation strategy, is everybody else eventually has to go back to work. And this was also a problem in BLM, by the way. There is a reason that it happened during the Floyd protests lasted longer and were bigger, being tied to the fact that people weren't working. One in which ultimately only students and the unemployed could participate in long term, while others felt that it was merely a temporary rallying point. Yeah, it's that ambiguity. The ab busters versus revolutionary kind of tension there. I think Hochuli is right about that. Regardless, the unifying factor was rejection. The protests were anti-political. Yes. And we also have to remember there were anti-political protests on the right before the Tea Party was astroturfed, which was astroturfed very early on. Don't get me wrong. But before the Tea Party was astroturfed, which is still during the Bush presidency, right? It was an anti-political libertarian protest. In Brazil, party emblems were banned. In Hong Kong, the key word was no stage, no leaders, no representation. The rejection of formality ran deep. Yes. But again, I think we tend, this pretends like this was just an ideological rejection of formality. There was a reason why things had gone that way. There's a reason why it'll try to course correct into soft Bonapartist populism too. I mean, there are reasons. If you don't understand the reasons, you can't understand how you could start guarding against them. That these ideological formations happened is important. How these ideological formations happen and why they happen is more important. Some mass protests were originally organized by a small nucleus with clear goals. Absolutely. Such was the case, which serves the central case study in If We Burn. I think Bevins relies too much on the Brazilian case and extrapolates them to the Arab Spring in a way that I don't think actually makes sense. In the Movimento Passe Livre, the MPL, our Free Fare movement, which was a group of anarchists agitating around the question of public transport. The MPO were organized on the basis that, quote, everyone does everything, that the resistance against division of labor works when you are a small, tight-knit group. But the protest developed and became the largest in Brazil's history. The group found no way of integrating new members. Yeah, that's pretty normal. Following the script that would play out in many other cases, a small protest came to face heavy repression. Think about Occupy and the attractive girls being arrested by the police on the first day, which caused Occupy to pop off and all over the United States. One of the ironies of this, very similar to the ironies of what happened in '68 with the Democratic Convention, is overzealous police repression is what made it popular. No one cared about another Adbusters protest in Zuccotti Park until they got hit by the cops. And it popped off all over the world this time, not just in the US. Now, there were already movements like this throughout Europe. So it's not to say that the US like led the way here. But it gave those other things a name and a focal point, but it was just a brand, similar to BLM in that sense. Black Lives Matter was a way to take myriad of organic industrial Rust Belt city black concerns to the rest of the world. It moved into the academy, became about changing the police, moved out of the academy again when the Floyd protests happened, and then there were a myriad of organizations, some of which did scam people, some of which were absolutely sincere, but there was no central organization holding together or accounting for them. And I find it interesting that that's one question that almost nobody here will talked about explicitly, is the problems with BLM and Me Too, not what they stood against in the way in which it is, often people like, oh, Me Too went too far. It's that they were signification movements. They were symbolic movements. BLM moved from, being about stopping the cops killing specific people in the industrial in Maryland, outside of St. Louis, etc., to adopting the language of upper middle class black activism back into the streets itself. And then, after 2020, you saw it pop off, but with massive cultural implications, but very little political implications. And I don't say that to criticize what brought BLM together, but I think that is similar to the MPL. All right. Following the script that would play out in many other cases, hear what I was saying, a small protest came to face heavy repression. Yep. See BLM, see Occupy, see Me Too is the exception to that. But anyway, widely circulating images of police violence against the wrong sort of victim, in this case, white, middle-class female journalist. See also Zuccotti Park, female activist being arrested on the cover of the New York Times, triggered something in the populace, and protests exploded, drawing huge masses of citizens, including right-wing citizens even. Like, that's the thing. That was the thing in Occupy, too. That was definitely true in the G8 protests in the 90s as well. Yet a fiercely anti-hierarchical group ended up relying on informal hierarchy of original friendship groups, effectively a decision-making clique with no accountability to anyone. I mean, that's the tyranny of structuralistness again. Although one of the things I find interesting is historically anarchists are not that structuralist. That's a post-60s thing. Jaeger and Borriello relate the same ironic process years later in France's FLI. The absence of the original party structures running from the grassroots to the leadership, obviated through digital consultancy and plebiscitary tools, led to super volunteers becoming a new sort of internal oligarchy, making decisions behind the backs of the mass of unlicensed importers who, in digital terms, would constitute lurkers. Asterisk. I think we saw this with the Obama movement as well. I mean, Obama didn't appoint any of these people to his cabinet. He actually appointed the right wing of the Clinton administrative apparatus to his cabinet, including Hillary Clinton. But in his organizational apparatus beforehand, he made a lot of people kind of backdoor oligarchs. It was one of the many ironic reversals that we encountered throughout history, where overcorrection ends up reproducing the original problem in a different form. Yes, absolutely. And we're going to see this. This is why I don't trust Bevins' like dependence on just verticalism, because verticalism failure led to horizontalism in the first place. The over brittleness of faction bands and whatever is why horizontalism became attractive. All right. I have to say we can't do either thing. It's too simple of a variable. The prejudice against formality even appears in dress. Gabriel Boric, now president of Chile, made his name in the student demonstrations of 2011, kind of like Kristen Sinema did and during Occupy, ironically. Boric isn't that much of a traitor, though. And then surfed the 2019 uprising all the way to the top job. When entering parliament in 2015, Boric turned heads when he showed up in a messy emo rock hair, trench coat, and no tie. Boric wasn't autonomous, unlike the MPL in Brazil, sought to distinguish himself from the old left and Leninist practices. In this sense, his style was in keeping with the new left that emerged in the 1960s. That is the one that was already 50 plus years old, which sought to reject anything that reeked of Stalinism. Asterisk. They didn't all seek to reject anything that reeked of Stalinism. The new communist movement was thoroughly Stalinist. It just rejected the USSR. Unasterisk. And so it opposed everything that was big, inflexible, centralized, organized, bureaucratic, and formal. I think Cotrone gets better into, and Gabriel Renat gets to the problem of these overly centralized but fragmenting and highly inefficient bureaucratic apparatuses that really were sclerotic in the middle of the 20th century, that led people to promote things that ended up looking like neoliberalism. This will lead me to one of the things that that Hochuli says that I think is facile, and I'll get to that in a minute. Bevins maintains a journalistic detachment throughout, but we can glimpse his true enemy is the anti-Soviet neo-Stalinist thinking, which he argues found an elective affinity with technological and corporate developments in the 2000s. Yeah, and that's superficial as fuck. I mean, this is why I know Bevins is a good journalist, but he's not really a good historian, nor is he a sound theorist. So just like the Brotherhood is based on Lenin's dual power model explicitly. The Muslim Brotherhood, for those of you who don't know. The revolution would not be terrorized, but it would be Facebooked. For all their resistance, young protesters bore striking similarities to the disposition of contemporary capitalism. Smash things up, something better will emerge from the wreck. It sounds awfully like a Silicon Valley style disruption. Oh, I don't know. Just like build up the productive forces sounds just like Fordism and Taylorism did in the beginning of the 20th century. If that's your critique, that it superficially resembles the capitalism as it already exists, that was true for the verticalist time period too. Capitalism was very vertical in the industrial development period. But it wasn't very profitable toward the end of that period, was it? Hence Schumpeter's ghost coming in on top of you. Or, in a nice touch that Bevins reserves for a footnote, it sounds like Obama, who claimed that his biggest mistake was failing to plan for the day after in Libya. I mean, he also didn't plan for the day after when he dealt with the banks. Anyway, 21st century capitalism continues to be anti-institutional, non-normative, anti-planning, short-termist, and rests of controlling flows more than building. Not true. Capital is short-termist. It is not anti-planning. It is not non-normative. It's norms shift. Even woke capital has a norm. It is not anti-institutional. It looks like it's anti-institutional, but we have been seeing monopolies develop that are very much institutionalized. So this assertion here, and I don't know if it's Bevins or Hochuli, but they seem to both make it, isn't really true. It gives the appearance of these things, but it is not these things. And if you do not understand that, you can't really understand why, for example, so much reshoring is happening on the old factory model, yet it doesn't resemble the beginning of the 20th century at all. Part of that's automation, though. What then is the point of the left that only reflects the dominant characteristics of the contemporary society back at it? I don't know. What was the point of that in Soviet developmentalism or in Douglas developmentalism? Did that not just reflect capitalism back at itself? It was justified that that needed to happen so the productive forces or or whatever the productive forces could be unleashed, etc. But let's be honest, it did look like capitalism, and they didn't even try to hide that. That so many bought into these ideas is tragic. I mean, yeah, but that critique is facile. We thought the representation was elitism, but it actually is the essence of democracy. No, it is not the essence of democracy. Remarks activist Hossam Bagan in Bevan's book, reflecting on the failure of the Egyptian revolution. Speaking English. Knowing the shape the counter-revolution took, that General Assisi's even more authoritarian dictatorship, one can only be left sad, bitter, and angry. Yeah, exactly. Except that the problem wasn't just that you needed representation. You needed organization. To posit representation and organization as the same thing is silly. During the third coming of the millennial left, the formation of parties resolved these deficiencies. See, this is the question, right? The thing is, this stuff, although Bevan's book is not about this, in the core, people start doing what someone like Bevins wants them to do. It doesn't go that well. Street protests were all open to all comers, and so the cost of exit were just as low. Yet, despite the turn to the party forum, left populism suffered from the same problem. For instance, Jeremy Corbyn was only elected leader of the Labour Party because, in an effort to dilute the influence of the trade unions, previous leader Ed Miliband had made membership available to the general public at the cost of only £3. Left populist party campaigners were built on an internet model. Anyone is a click away from registering, starting an action group, and campaigning for party candidates. I mean, that's always been true in the U.S., kind of. Membership in the Democratic Party is just something, the Republican Party, that has no cost. You are also one click away from dropping out. And this has its benefits in the ecosystem of unmediated democracy. It was an unmediated democracy. Malleability allowed left populists to attract voters beyond traditional class-based alignments. We could already see a problem with this, though. Just saying, people who studied the American primary system should have seen this coming. Because this has been a problem in the American primary system for both left and right for a long time. A charismatic leader, a Bonapartist one, or one who devotes, whose devotees project values, unifies the movement. Yes. Such as a personalization of politics has always been the political norm for at least 30 years. 30 years? That's it? 30 years? Try to last 90 years, dude. Was not the mass politics also the age of mass Bonapartism in the 1930s? New communication tools and techniques attract the youth. An anti-establishment attitude captures a prevailing sentiment. With no powerful institutions like the labor movement to call upon, leftists will force the battle of the electoral arena, therefore launching a true left populist gamble, as Gambarello put it. Yeah, and although that always was kind of circular, like we need to win state power to bring back the workers' movement so that we could use the workers' movement to seize state power. It was kind of a catch-22 that was a fundamental contradiction at the Bernie movement, and to a lesser degree the Corbyn movement. The Corbyn movement had another thing it had to deal with, is it wanted to bring back a 70s style British economy without the empire. And that's real hard to do, since they had dismantled their productive apparatus even more deeply than the United States had. The United States hadn't really dismantled it. It had just automated it. This attack on the very idea of mediation presupposes a rapid assault on power. Yes, as if by surprise, Gambarello remarked. Bernie Sanders had hoped to go from being a forgotten, fussy old lefty senator to leader of the free world in the space of 18 months. Yeah, that was nuts to think about. That may not have played out, but Syriza really did transform from a new, small, radical left coalition to a unifying and representing all the segments of society frustrated by austerity. Originally identified with the protesters, in a short space of time, it became recognized representative of the social majority, and it took office, and we know what happened next. Yeah, we do. Jaeger and Borriello argue that the left populist gamble is premised on a wholly different understanding of the bourgeois democratic political party. Its goal is no longer about entrenching voting blocks over the long run, but about serving the best disposable tool for each electoral contrast. Yeah, this is already happening. And this happens on the right too. Which is why it's actually why the rights become more coalitional and harder to predict their ideology than they were in the 90s and aughts. They're a coalitional base within a pretty clear group of the uneducated petite bourgeoisie and some workers. Higher educated petite bourgeoisie. Everyone's educated in this society. Again, the speculative, flexible, and opportunistic nature of left populism eerily reflects the functioning of capitalism today. Again, that's not a critique. This should alert us to the fact that the questions that fetch left populism to lie or not with the institutional center left, digital pop-up blitzkrieg or bill party structures, place yourself on the left-right axis or try to be indeterminate, are not merely organizational. I agree with this second part. Cotrone is in agreement within the Marxist tradition. Revolutionaries Rosa Luxemburg and Vladimir Lenin stand in part for spontaneity versus organization, respectively. Citing J.P. Nettle, Luxemburg's biographer, Cotrone notes that both the German and Russian revolutionary leaders address contemporary questions which can't be reduced to that simple dichotomy. Yes, and you can't reduce it to horizontalism or verticalism either. How does political action enable the transformative organization, and how does political organization enable transformative emancipatory and not foreclosing actions? These are the questions that one must be addressed to the millennial left, because organizational problems are more than just impediments. They are symptoms that need to be worked through. Bing, bing, bing. Correct, Alex and Cotrone. Perhaps we need to be more conservative in our revolutionary politics in order to actually be radical in the present, Cotrone concludes. Well, perhaps indeed. Or perhaps not. I don't even know what conservative means in this context. This might as well apply to another postmodern innovation, leaderism. Leaderism? Just call it Bonapartism, and that's not postmodern. Examined by sociologist Paulo Gerbalto a few years earlier, the left electoral movements of the 2010s relied on hyper leaders, Bonapartists, that actually didn't take power, who draw legitimacy from emotional recognition and acclaim of their base rather than legal investiture by the party. So, failed Bonapartist. This is not new. I find that pretending this is new is like kind of crazy to me. The personalization of politics around leaders serves to compensate for the absence of mediating structures between the base and the leader. Do we remember the early 20th century? There are no local branches, no cadres, and indeed no real party loyalty. That is different. Okay, so leaderism is like Bonapartism with the collaborationism, but no structure. Okay, maybe let's try to fix this theoretically, because theoretically this is a little weak. We talk of Corbynism, Mélenchonisme, Pablismo, etc. This is different from Leninism, Maoism, or Trotskyism, terms which represent variations of a common body of thought, socialism, and are thus total philosophies. No, they weren't. Absolutely no, they weren't. Maoism is like Maoism and Trotskyism are like 5 things that have radically different presumptions. Orthodox versus unorthodox, state capitalist versus collective, bureaucratic collective versus degenerated worker state versus defensist. Although the degenerated worker state was also defensist. Terms which represent a common body of thought, socialism and those total philosophies. No, they weren't. This division is much weaker. Maoism developed into Maoist third worldism. Mao Zedong thought, which was only applicable to China. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is a kind of market reform version of Mao Zedong thought. Maoist international Marxism, which is third worldism. Maoist third worldism proper. All right. Many of which rejected formal institutions are divided the Sino-Soviet split. So they were not nearly as unified as they put up here. But they weren't mere personalities either. the thing that unites Leninism, Maoism, and Trotskyism is that, as opposed to like Marxist Leninism or Stalinism, actually, is that the codification of them and their splintering happen after their thinkers are dead. That's the difference. So they are not, they attempt to be total philosophies, but they're fractures in the case they couldn't be. Whereas we don't even get that far with Corbynism, Sanderismo, whatever. So, you know, first as tragedy, then as farce. I wish Hochuli would have explored that a little more. As the authors rightly insist, leaderism is not really the overcoming of leaderlessness. It is not a cure, but a symptom of the same problem. The anti-Stalinism of the horizontal occupations transformed into something more personalistic than Stalinism itself. That's fair. More personalistic in the sense that it was about projections upon images of a collaborationist leader. Absolutely. The problem with the media is something where I think Bevins is actually really insightful, but Bevins is a journalist, so it makes sense. Leaderism also generates new problems. The populist hyper leader, I like how they make up new terms for shit, is meant to be a down-to-earth and morally irreproachable. You know, like we see on the right with George Bush, who played this role until he didn't anymore, and Trump, who plays this role now. Although no one plays Trump to be morally irreproachable, they do see him as down-to-earth and, let's say, heroically immoral. It is a political truism that he who rides the highest horse falls the hardest. So it proved with Corbyn, destroyed by accusations of anti-Semitism, or Mélenchon, undermined by media attention on a short temper, or Iglesias, who was found to have bought a 600-euro house with his political and life partner, Irene Montero. The hyper leader carries so many hopes and expectations that when he fails, so does the whole project. Bingo. And I have noticed this problem on both the left and the right in America, even outside of the left. Like, this idea of the populist hyper leader comes up. I don't like the term hyper leader, but I'm going to use it here. And like people who run the same losing candidates, like Cynthia McKinney, over and over and over again, as a way to reinvigorate the party due to personalism, even though they can't win their own districts or states. As Jaeger and Borriello note in reference to Jeremy Corbyn, the project relied on new media to communicate with enthusiastic millennial voters, circumventing the mainstream media. But this underscored how much of a media affair it was. A media party will always be vulnerable to media attacks. Absolutely. This is also something that Bivens talks about too. The mediating nature of so much of the millennial left politics comes through loud and clear in Bevins' study of the protest decade. Already in the introduction, he notes the experience of May 68 came to be reduced to those who were selected to appear on TV to talk about it in the aftermath. Absolutely. Bevins is right about that. Naturally, the more trained and educated. Although, you know, I hate to tell people, but the more trained and educated also tended to be leaders in Leninist parties. And I mean, even today, if you look at some of the Leninist sectarians, they're run by petty millionaires. When the 2010s mass protests began to be even more inchoate than in the 1960s, the space for imposing ex post facto meaning on them was ever greater. Over the course of the book, we find fights over who controlled the social media accounts were a feature of both New York's Occupy and Spain's Indignados. And Brazil's LNP would share media responsibilities, but they would certainly make sure to offer the media some sort of content they love to run. Asterisk. I think this is what we see in a lot of these movements. I mean, Novara Media almost personifies this shift. They start off as kind of quasi-anarchist, Marxist autonomist in the 2010s, obsessed with Italian communism. They move through into Corbynism, and now they're like the sad, you know, loyal opposition and post-new labor, which is also itself a sad loyal opposition to a highly fractious but seemingly unseatable Tory movement. As Bevins remarks about Egypt in the crucial moment of late January 2021, the revolutionaries could have taken anything. They could have chosen to stay in Tahrir Square, but their default destination for many in the crowd was an empty piece of land, and the contrast offered no strategic value except for its visibility. Yeah, they could not have chosen to take anything. They did not have arms to take the military, Bevins. Okay? That is something that you aren't dealing with. The absence of clear political and class identities and meanings that were symbols saw elsewhere. Well, the class identities in Egypt are complicated anyway. I mean, a lot of people participating were upper middle class, and a lot of people participating were shut out of work. One of the leading participants in Brazil's June days tells Bevins that the activist group's main influence was the Mexico Zapatistas, whose struggle had been introduced to them in the 90s via Rage Against the Machine. A whole lot of people got introduced to, not just the Zapatistas, Rage Against the Machine also introduced people to the Sandinistas, to the Shining Path. They were kind of indiscriminate in what radical groups they shared. I mean, that was the thing about them, is you would find Stalinist and anarchist and even Christopher Lash on the back of a Rage Against the Machine album. In Hong Kong, a three-finger salute taken from the Hunger Games film became a common marker. I remember Mark Fisher picking that up too. I think it is also a little sad and definitely unfortunate that we got so many of our ideas from pop culture when Hong Kongers included. Yes, it is. The Ozarks character of politics at the end of history was in full display in the demonstrations. In Ukraine's Euromaidan, after Viktor Yanukovych announced that he was not taking the EU's deal, one group of leftists took red flags embroidered with EU stars on it. Europe here was represented as not austerity and acting democracy, but social democracy and human progress, prosperity and rights. You know how many flags, though, were up in Euromaidan? I saw Confederate flags up in Euromaidan, and communist flags, and. All right? One of the things I do not like about both Bevins and to a lesser degree Hochuli is how selective they are in showing you how, you know, Bevins admits that these were mixed groups that had multi-layers and character, including some right-wing ones, and yet it's presented as like, oh, it was a bunch of flabby anarchists, which it was not. Now, I can't speak to Ukraine, I've never been there, but I was in Egypt afterwards, and I was in South Korea, and I was in Mexico during the protest days in Oaxaca. And I did not just see horizontalist anarchists. I also saw verticalist sects that also couldn't achieve much. Reflecting on the missing revolution, Bevins asked himself whether mass insurrections were genuine moments, glimpses into the way life is really supposed to be, and the real thing that one can never feel, or if on the contrary, they were empty expressions of mass ecstasy, having more in common with Woodstock and Coachella than the storming of the Bastille. Yeah, that's a false binary. Bevins seems to be plagued with false binaries. Oh, it's either totally authentic, like the storming of the Bastille, is totally inauthentic, like Woodstock and Coachella. The storming of Bastille probably rhymes more with Woodstock and Coachella when you actually know what happened there. It was a largely symbolic gesture, actually. This is a person who doesn't seem to know that, like, the Bastille didn't even have that many prisoners in it when they stormed it. He concludes that the people went back and forth on this, and one suspects it's the author's view too. Yeah, I think because the question can't be answerable. You can't know if the Bastille is going to be a spectacle or not till the rest of history unfolds. It's something that's only answerable in the hindsight. It's kind of like when you go to valorize your profits by selling something that's been valued, and you don't sell it for as much as it's been valued for. You realize that a lot of that profitability was fictitious. Well, whether or not this is the way life is really meant to be, or just a spectacle, will be decided in its conclusion. As Aristotle said, call no man happy till it dies, and the same goes with movements. You don't know until the end. In lieu of a definitive conclusion, Bevins' direct political object is a combination of Western journalists and their synergistic relationship with educated professionals, often from nonprofits who they selected as mouthpieces for the uprising. Yes! Although I also think Bevins is ironically, even though he's aware of this, kind of doing it in his book. I need to go back through and read it closely, though. But I feel like it still suffers from not having a lot of, like, I don't know, Muslim Brotherhood people explaining what happened in Tahrir Square. The Western media gave special attention to the euphoric, prefigurative, and ultra-democratic elements that within the revolt, he notes, in regards to Egypt, and you claim the liberal ring of Euromaidan included workers in the tech sector who were mostly pro-Brussels, who spoke the language of democratic ideals and confident English, and were associated with NGOs and who had full-time employees, trained and paid, and interact with people like me, Bevins. Absolutely. However, there was plenty of people who weren't that. There were plenty of people who even very right-wing in that, and yes, they didn't get promoted on Western television, obviously. It is this very presidential dynamic which complicates an already difficult task, finding the truth of the movements. Well, there are multiple truths in these movements, and Bevins actually points that out, which makes Bevins' book kind of frustrating. There's evident manipulability here. Yes, there is. But there always is. Before the political program is set, you never know these things. In Brazil, a right-wing pro-business group was able to seize leadership over the left-wing social democratic protests by astroturfing themselves. Their name, MBL, Free Brazil Movement. Almost indistinguishable, especially in spoken in Portuguese, from the autonomous initiators of the June 2013 protest, MPL. In Ukraine, far-right nationalists became the predominant force in Maidan, punching above their weight. Yes, they did. Absolutely. As one of Bevins' interviewees explains, they did not pull this off because regular Ukrainians supported them. They fought for it, and they won. Yes. We're going to stop here. We'll go with the problem of rupture in part 4. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. I have a Patreon. You can get access to all my archives, all the audio versions of these shows if you'd rather listen to them on your phone than watch them on YouTube. Additional shows. Shows that I only give to Patreons, etc. I give a lot of material, and it's cheap. You get access to audio for everything for $3. Thank you for supporting this educational project. Have a great day.